After the judge read the will, the maid stood up, and everyone in the room froze. I still remember the day I first walked into the Harrington estate. I was just a scared girl from a small town, barely 22, trying to make something of myself. My mom had passed away, and I had no family left to rely on. The job offer came through a distant acquaintance. I didn't ask questions, I just packed my bags and showed up. The Harringtons were well known, wealthy, respected. Mr. Edward Harrington was one of those men whose mere presence commanded attention without a raised voice. His wife, Margaret, had died the year before, and her absence hung heavy in the house. Her scent still lingered in the corridors. Her portrait still smiled from the walls. The mansion felt like it was holding its breath. At first, I kept to myself cleaning, cooking, folding laundry, looking after the children. There were 4 of them: Elizabeth, James, Laura, and Michael. I wiped their tears, bandaged their scraped knees, and sang lullabies when their nanny was off duty. But I was still the help. You learn to be invisible in places like that, speak only when spoken to, move through rooms without leaving a trace. I was good at it. But Mr. Harrington was different. Some evenings, after the kids were asleep and the house grew still, he'd sit at the kitchen table. I'd be wiping down counters or wrapping leftovers, and he'd start talking not to anyone in particular, just talking. He shared stories about his late wife, how she loved roses, how they'd dance in the parlor after the kids were tucked in, how he missed her laughter. I'd listen quietly, nodding occasionally, saying little. Maybe he just needed someone who wouldn't ask for anything, someone who'd listen without judgment. Over the years, I stayed. I stayed through birthdays, holidays, heartbreaks, and graduations. I stayed as the children grew up and moved out, as the house grew quieter and Mr. Harrington grew older. When the cancer came, I stayed through that too. I remember the day he sat me down and said, "Lila, I don't have much time left." I didn't speak, just took his hand and held it. "I want you to know," he said, his voice trembling, "you've been more family to me than most who share my name." I cried that night, not in front of him, of course. I waited until I was alone in the laundry room, letting tears fall into a stack of clean towels. When he passed, it felt like a piece of me went with him. He was the only person who ever made me feel like I belonged in that house. I didn't expect to be invited to the reading of the will. I assumed the children would handle everything, split the fortune, and that would be it. But a letter arrived with my name on it, summoning me to the courthouse on a Wednesday morning. I went unsure why. I wore the same black dress I'd worn to his funeral, the one I kept for special occasions. I sat in the back, as always. The Harrington children filled the room, grown now, dressed in tailored suits and expensive coats. They looked like they belonged there. I didn't. The judge began reading the will, and it all sounded as expected. To James, he left the family business. To Elizabeth, the countryside villa. Laura got the rare book collection. Michael received the stock portfolio. They nodded politely, barely blinking, as if it were all routine, just waiting to sign the papers. Then the judge paused, his eyes scanning the document, then the room. "To Miss Lila Carter," he said, clearing his throat, "for her steadfast loyalty, quiet strength, and the love she gave me when I had nothing left to offer, I leave the Harrington estate in full." Silence. I thought I'd misheard. Maybe he'd said someone else's name. I glanced around, all eyes were on me. I stood slowly, legs trembling, my heart pounding so loud I swore they could hear it. Elizabeth stood too, her voice sharp like shattered glass. "This has to be a mistake." She was the maid. The room seemed to tilt. The judge didn't falter. He kept reading. "In her, I found comfort. In her, I found home. When the world moved on without me, she stayed. When I could no longer speak, she heard me. When I could no longer walk, she carried me with grace, patience, and love. In return, I give her the home we shared because no one deserves it more." I couldn't breathe. No one spoke after that. The Harrington children stormed out, one by one, without so much as a glance my way, without a goodbye. I left the courthouse stunned, unsure if it was real. That night, I drove back to the estate in silence, not an empty silence, but one heavy with memories, wonder, and questions I couldn't answer. The house looked the same, grand, proud, with its white pillars and oak-lined driveway. But it felt different now. For the first time in over 30 years, I didn't park by the servants' entrance. I pulled up to the front, where the family always did. My hand shook as I turned the key in the door. The lock clicked open, smooth as ever, but the sound hit differently this time. I stepped inside slowly. The scent of polished wood and old books wrapped around me like a familiar embrace. I wasn't just entering a house, I was stepping into a life I'd never dreamed could be mine. My shoes clicked softly on the marble floors as I crossed the foyer. The portraits of Harrington ancestors still hung on the walls, their painted eyes watching. For a moment, I wondered what they'd think if they knew the maid had inherited it all. I made my way to the kitchen, the heart of the house, my favorite place. It was unchanged. The worn table in the corner, the small nick in the counter where one of the kids dropped a skillet, the faded stool where Mr. Harrington used to sit while I brewed his coffee. I stood in the doorway for a long time, just looking, remembering. Then I whispered, "Thank you." It was barely audible, but it carried everything: gratitude, sorrow, love, shock. He didn't have to do this. He could have left the house to his children, to charity, to anyone. But he chose me. He saw Methruff all those quiet years when I cleared tables after dinners I wasn't invited to, wrapped gifts I'd never opened, stayed late so the kids could be tucked in. He noticed. He gave me more than a house. He gave me worth. He gave me dignity. He gave me a place in a world that often made me feel I had none. He gave me a stormy story where I wasn't just a shadow in the background. I was someone who mattered. I walked to his stool, ran my fingers across its surface, and sat down for the first time ever. I looked around the kitchen and let myself just be no apron, no chores, no clock counting down my break. Just me. I sat there for a long time, not because I didn't know what to do next, but because I wanted to feel it all: the years, the loss, the unexpected gift of being seen after decades of invisibility. That day in the courtroom, I was finally seen. And in the quiet of that familiar kitchen, I let myself believe it.